The dust tasted of ages, a gritty film settling on my tongue, on my skin, on the very air I breathed. I'd traded the sterile hum of laboratories for this dry, silent expanse, this archaeological dig revealing temple beneath temple, a place where the earth exhaled secrets buried deeper than any star. My hands, once accustomed to the delicate calibration of sensitive instruments, were now stained with ochre soil, tracing the faint etchings on a stone tablet. It felt absurd. Me, James, the disgraced astrophysicist, reduced to a scavenger of forgotten gods. They called it a disgrace, that Mars mission, a catastrophic failure. The whispers still echoed in the hollow spaces of my mind, amplified by the vast emptiness that now surrounded me. Lives lost. My fault. The calculations, the projections, the blind faith in my own brilliance that had shattered into a million pieces, scattering across the desolate Martian plains. I'd retreated from the world, from the accusing eyes and the pitying glances. This remote dig, a forgotten corner of the globe where the past was literally being unearthed, was my penance. Or perhaps my tomb. The sun beat down with a relentless fury, bleaching the sky to a pale, indifferent blue. My tent, a flimsy barrier against the elements, offered little respite. Inside, amidst the clutter of my meager belongings, sat the salvaged equipment from my former life. A battered laptop, its screen a portal to a world I no longer belonged to, and a jury-rigged radio telescope, its dish pointed skyward like a desperate plea. It was a relic, a ghost of my ambition. I'd brought it here, a foolish indulgence, a way to keep a sliver of my old self alive. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise a repetition of the last. The rhythmic scrape of trowels, the low murmur of the excavation crew, the distant cry of a hawk, these were the sounds of my new existence. I'd watch them, the archaeologists, their faces etched with a different kind of obsession, unearthing pottery shards, fragments of bone, the ghosts of a civilization long extinct. They were on their own quest, a journey into the deep past. Mine, I thought, was a journey into the void. Then it happened. A flicker on the laptop screen, an anomaly in the static. At first, I dismissed it. A pattern, faint but undeniable, repeating with an unnerving regularity. It wasn't natural. It was too precise, too structured, too alien. My heart, a muscle I'd long thought numb, began to thrum against my ribs. A tremor ran through my hands as I adjusted the gain, filtering out the ambient noise. The signal grew stronger, resolving itself from the hiss. It was a sequence of pulses, a complex, interwoven rhythm that defied any known astronomical phenomenon. It emanated from a region of space I knew intimately, a sector that had been meticulously mapped, catalogued, and declared empty. I zoomed in on the coordinates, cross-referencing with the stellar databases. Nothing, not a single celestial body, not even a rogue asteroid. It was a signal from nowhere, a phantom in the cosmic ether. This was not the triumphant return of a celestial body, no undiscovered planet or rogue comet. This felt different, older, deeper. The implications began to unfold in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. If this signal was artificial, it implied intelligence. An intelligence capable of broadcasting across unimaginable distances from a point in space that defied our current understanding. And if it was from a place that shouldn't exist, what did that mean? Was it a message? A warning? I replayed the sequence, my eyes glued to the waveform. A language that spoke of things humanity was never meant to know. The archaeologists unearthed temples, physical structures built by human hands, tangible proof of past lives. But this signal was a temple of a different kind, a vast, invisible edifice built from pure information, existing in the silent expanse between the stars. And I, James, was standing at its threshold. What ancient entity had created this signal, and why was it reaching out now? The air here was different. It was thinner, yes, but it carried a weight, a density that pressed against my eardrums. The dust, the incessant, ancient dust of this archaeological dig revealing temple beneath temple, seemed to whisper. Or maybe that was just the wind, a mournful sigh through the skeletal remains of forgotten structures. I'd been drawn here by the silence, by the promise of an emptiness that might finally drown out the echoes of my own failure. But emptiness, I was learning, was a relative concept. The signal. Now it was a roar, a symphony of impossibilities that vibrated in the very marrow of my bones. I'd rigged a makeshift receiver, a tangle of wires and salvaged components humming precariously in the dim light of my tent. It was crude, laughable by professional standards, but it captured the anomaly. It captured it. I sat hunched over the console, the faint glow of the readouts illuminating the grime on my face. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, food a distant memory. The signal was all that mattered. It pulsed, a rhythmic heartbeat unlike any celestial body I'd ever charted. It wasn't random. There was structure, a deliberate architecture to its fluctuations. I'd spent days, then weeks, tracing its origin. The uncharted nebula, a smudge of cosmic dust and gas I'd dismissed as an anomaly of observation, was its source. Now that smudge felt like a gaping maw. My colleagues back at the Institute, or what was left of them who still bothered to answer my sporadic, increasingly frantic calls, were dismissive. "James, you're chasing ghosts," the former department head had said, his voice laced with a pity that stung more than outright derision. "The strain is getting to you. Come back, we can. Manage. Manage," as if my disgrace was a disease they could quarantine. They couldn't hear the signal. They couldn't feel its insistent thrumming in their teeth. They were safe in their sterile, predictable universe. But this signal, it was like nothing known. It wasn't radio waves. It wasn't gamma rays. It was something else, something that seemed to bypass the physical to resonate directly with something deep within my own consciousness. I saw patterns in the data, intricate geometries that shifted and reformed, hinting at a language, a thought process that was alien and vast. It was beautiful in a terrifying, overwhelming way. I started to sketch. Not equations, not star charts, but abstract designs. Spirals that seemed to fold in on themselves, impossible angles, forms that defied Euclidean space. They emerged from the signal, imprinted on my mind like a brand. I felt a growing unease, a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the very dust that choked the air. They weren't random gusts anymore. They were forming sounds, faint but distinct, a language I couldn't understand, but that seemed to carry an immense weight of sorrow, of longing, of something far older than stars. One evening the signal changed. It intensified not in volume but in complexity. A new layer emerged, a subtle distortion that felt like a presence. It was as if the signal itself was acknowledging my attempts to decipher it. The hairs on my arms stood on end. My heart, that traitorous muscle, began a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. It felt less like fear and more like recognition. The patterns on my sketchpad seemed to glow, pulsing in sync with the signal. I stared at them, my eyes burning, my mind a frantic whirlwind. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an invitation, or perhaps a summons. The ancient entity, the unfathomable intelligence I had begun to suspect, was it aware of me? Stirring, the dust settled, a soft shroud over the world, and the signal continued its impossible song. What was it trying to tell me? Or maybe that was just the wind, a mournful sigh through the skeletal remains of a long-forgotten civilization. I'd come here chasing ghosts, the spectral echoes of a collapsed star, but I was finding something far older, something buried not just in the earth, but in the very fabric of the cosmos. My makeshift lab, a tent pitched precariously between crumbling obsidian monoliths, was a stark contrast to the raw antiquity surrounding it. Screens flickered, displaying waveforms that defied every known law of physics. The signal, it was still there, a persistent thrumming beneath the static, a whisper from the abyss. But now I had a location, a cosmic graveyard where no light, no energy should exist. A nebula that wasn't on any chart, a phantom limb of the universe. My fingers, stained with the ochre dust of ages, trembled as I cross-referenced the extrapolated coordinates. The constellation was familiar, a scattering of stars I'd studied for decades. But the region itself, it was a black hole of data. Entire sectors rendered blank, devoid of even the faintest background radiation. The astronomers called them dead zones, anomalies attributed to instrument error or simply unobserved phenomena. I'd spent weeks sifting through the detritus of this ancient place. The dig site was an excavation of the impossible. Layer upon layer of masonry, each stratum older than the last, hinting at a civilization that predated recorded history by millennia. Now I wasn't so sure. One of the archaeologists, a stern woman with eyes that had seen too much of the past, had shown me fragments of clay tablets. They were brittle, the script alien and jagged, but the recurring symbols. They resonated with the patterns I was seeing on my screens. Concept. Now the laughter felt like a memory from another life. The signal was no longer a gentle hum. It was a crescendo, a symphony of the utterly alien. The waveforms twisted and contorted, coalescing into patterns that were both mathematically elegant and deeply disturbing. My vision blurred at the edges, the stark lines of my equipment seeming to waver, to breathe. The air, already heavy, felt thick with unseen presence. I found another tablet, this one larger, more intact. The script was denser, more urgent. It described a vast, formless entity that dwelled in the spaces between stars, a being that fed on. What? Not matter. Not energy, but something far more fundamental. It spoke of awakening, of the unraveling. A sharp whine pierced the relative quiet of my tent. A spike on the primary display, an anomaly so profound it made my teeth ache. The signal had shifted. It was no longer just a series of pulses. It was intricate, layered, almost conversational. My own thoughts felt sluggish, like wading through thick mud. The dust motes dancing in the beam of my headlamp seemed to coalesce, forming fleeting, impossible shapes. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus to regain control. A low, guttural chorus speaking in a language that bypassed my ears and settled directly into my bones. The signal on the screen pulsed, a sickly green light reflecting in my wide, unblinking eyes. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. What was it saying, and why was it calling to me, James? The whine faded, leaving a ringing silence in my ears. My breath hitched. Conversational. It wasn't just a pattern. It was structured. I leaned closer to the monitor, my grip tight against the worn metal of my console. The data scrolled, a cascade of numbers and waveforms, but my mind was grappling with something far more abstract. This wasn't the radio static of a dying star, nor the predictable hum of a distant pulsar. This was deliberate. I spent the next cycle hunched over the equipment, fueled by stale ration bars and a gnawing, exhilarating dread. Sleep felt like a betrayal. It was deeper than any star, older than any known celestial body. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. I'd been trying to parse it as language, as a structured sequence of information to be translated. But the more I analyzed, the less it resembled anything human or even biological. It wasn't a message from something, but the thing itself. The signal was a manifestation, a tremor in existence caused by an immense presence. It was a consciousness, or something akin to it, a will so ancient and alien it had no need for words. It simply was, and it's being rippled through the cosmos, detectable only by those who dared to look too closely. My fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating recurring motifs, not as phonemes or symbols, but as fundamental concepts. Not hello or danger, but expressions of pure, unadulterated existence. It was like trying to understand a color that had never been seen, a sound that had never been heard. The sheer scale of it was crushing. This wasn't just some advanced civilization. This was something that predated civilization, perhaps even life as we understood it. I felt a tremor in the ground beneath my makeshift shelter. Not the rumble of a distant seismic event, but a subtle, localized vibration, as if the very earth were sighing. I dismissed it, my focus still locked on the screen. The signal was growing stronger, its complexity increasing exponentially. It was like a vast, unseen ocean tide was beginning to lap at the shores of our reality. Then a low thrumming began, emanating from the ground itself. It was deep, resonant, and utterly wrong. It vibrated in my bones, a discordant note in the symphony of the universe. My equipment began to malfunction, screens displaying static, then bizarre geometric patterns that bore no resemblance to any known data. I scrambled to shut down the primary receiver, my hands clumsy and trembling. The thrumming intensified, a physical pressure against my eardrums. The air grew heavy, thick with an ozone-like tang that burned my nostrils. It smelled like the moments before a lightning strike, but amplified, suffocating. I looked out of the tent flap. The desert, usually a stark canvas of sand and rock under the alien sky, seemed different. The stars themselves appeared to warp, their light bending and twisting as if viewed through flawed glass. The thrumming reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. My teeth rattled in my skull. A wave of nausea washed over me. The lights in the tent died completely, plunging me into blackness. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, my heart racing. Nothing seemed overtly damaged, but the feeling was of something immense having passed, something that had left its indelible, horrific mark. I crawled out of the tent, the sand cool beneath my bare feet. The sky was clear, the stars in their usual places, yet the distortion I'd seen moments before lingered in my mind's eye. The thrumming had ceased, but the air still tasted wrong, metallic, and acrid. My primary receiver, sitting on its tripod outside the tent, was emitting a faint, sickly green glow. The display was shattered, not as if from impact, but as if it had been melted from the inside. It was still warm to the touch. I backed away slowly, my gaze fixed on the ruined equipment. The signal was gone, or rather it had changed. It was here. It was in the air, in the very sand beneath my feet. I hadn't just detected it, I had attracted it. And now it was awake, but why here and why now? My breath hitched. Conversational. The data scrolled, a cascade of numbers and waveforms, but my mind was grappling with something far older than the silicon that processed it. The signal wasn't a message, it was a presence, an immense, slumbering consciousness stirring. I spent days sifting through the spectral lines, the temporal distortions, the impossible geometries that the signal painted in the void. My small, rented observatory, perched on this desolate ridge overlooking the churning gray sea, felt impossibly small. The wind howled outside, a constant, mournful counterpoint to the silent roar of the cosmos I was trying to decipher. I ate little, slept less. The only sustenance was the raw, terrifying beauty of the data. It wasn't an entity in the nebula. It was the nebula, or rather the nebula was a manifestation of its outer skin, a blister on existence where it pressed too close. The signal wasn't broadcast, it was leakage, a cosmic leak. My past failure, the one that had stripped me of my credentials, my colleagues, my reputation, felt like a child's scraped knee compared to the immensity of this. I had been trying to map stars, and I had found this. The implications began to coalesce, not like a comforting sunrise, but like the slow, inexorable creep of frost across a window pane. This being, if it could even be called that, wasn't driven by malice. It simply was. Its awakening was not an act of aggression, but a natural process, like a mountain crumbling or a star collapsing. And its sheer, unthinking existence was anathema to everything we understood. Our laws of physics, our very perception of reality, were fragile constructs, like sandcastles against an incoming tide. My fingers trembled as I traced a particularly complex waveform on the screen. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic throb that seemed to resonate not just in the speakers, but in the marrow of my bones. It was a heartbeat ancient beyond reckoning, and it was growing stronger. The nebula, the supposed uncharted region, was the focal point, the nexus. The entity was using it as a kind of anchor, a point of entry. I needed more. I needed to see the source, not just its echo. The signal, though faint, was directional, but the data insisted otherwise. There was something there, something that didn't belong. My gaze drifted to the worn photographs tacked to the wall above my console. Faces smiling, faces I no longer recognized. My former colleagues, my wife, the life I'd shattered. They had warned me. They had begged me to stop, and I hadn't listened. Now the stakes were infinitely higher. I found myself poring over obscure academic journals, dusty texts on forgotten civilizations, cross-referencing ancient astronomical charts with my modern data. It was a desperate Hail Mary attempt. And then I found it. A paper, barely a footnote in a forgotten journal, detailing an archaeological dig revealing temple beneath temple, buried deep beneath the sands of a remote desert. The dig had unearthed strange iconography, depictions of celestial bodies arranged in impossible configurations, and cryptic inscriptions that spoke of a great sleeper that predated the stars. The patterns described, though allegorical, mirrored the waveforms I was seeing. The paper mentioned a specific artifact, a crystalline shard recovered from the deepest stratum that was said to hum with an unheard frequency. The description of its properties, its resonance, its effect on ambient energy fields sent a jolt of ice through me. It was a natural amplifier, a conduit. And the dig site, according to the faded coordinates, was located in the general direction of the nebula. Viewed from Earth's perspective millennia ago, this wasn't just a signal anymore. It was an echo of a physical manifestation. The entity was not merely awakening, it was reaching. And it had been for a very long time. The nebula was a beacon, a lighthouse for something that existed outside our understanding, and I, James, had stumbled upon its call. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was the choice, the one I had always feared. I could pack up my equipment, erase the data, and flee. I could try to forget what I had seen, live out my days as the disgraced scientist, haunted by a phantom signal, or I could try to understand, to intervene, to stop a process that was as inevitable as gravity, as fundamental as time. I looked at the monitor, at the pulsing waveform that seemed to breathe with a life of its own, and it was growing louder. The wind outside my observatory rattled the windows, a sudden, violent gust. It felt like a warning. My hand hovered over the console, fingers poised to delete, but the numbers continued to scroll, unbidden, insistent. The data wasn't just data anymore, it was a map to the edge of everything, and I was standing on the precipice. What would happen if I deleted it? Would the entity simply find another way? The silence was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Conversational. The word echoed in my mind, a blasphemy against the void. I traced the waveform on the screen, a delicate, impossible dance of energy. It wasn't just structured, it was speaking, but to whom or to what? My hands trembled not from fear, but from a desperate, gnawing certainty. This signal was a key, and I was fumbling with the lock. I needed to understand. I needed to respond. The old theories, the abandoned hypotheses, they all came rushing back. A flood of forgotten equations and dismissed observations. The entity, whatever it was, existed outside our known dimensions, a concept so vast it made my head ache. But the signal, It was a bridge, a fragile, terrifying bridge. My equipment was crude, cobbled together in this forgotten corner of the observatory, far from the prying eyes of the academic world that had cast me out. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. I began to reconfigure the array, rerouting power, pushing the ancient servers to their limits. I had to create a counter-frequency, a modulated pulse designed to disrupt, to confuse, to silence. A foolish hope, perhaps, but the only one I had. The air in the control room grew thick with the hum of overloaded circuits. Dust motes danced in the faint light of the monitors, illuminated by a glow that felt too warm, too alive. My fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting commands, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel it, a subtle pressure building, a distortion at the edges of my perception. The world outside the reinforced windows, the desolate landscape surrounding the observatory, seemed to waver, as if seen through heat haze. Then a flicker, not on my screen but in the room itself. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a lingering scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and deeply unpleasant like old blood. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching unease. This was not just a signal anymore, it was an awareness. I pushed on, my resolve hardening into a desperate, almost manic focus. The counter-frequency was almost ready. A symphony of calculated noise, a sonic scream designed to pierce the veil. I imagined it, a wave of pure disruption rippling outwards, tearing at the fabric of the signal. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently. The hum of the machinery deepened, becoming a guttural groan. The monitors, which had been displaying the elegant waveforms of the signal, devolved into static, a chaotic blizzard of white noise. A low, resonant thrumming began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that felt less heard and more felt, resonating deep within my bones. My colleague, the one who had been so skeptical, so dismissive, burst into the control room, his face pale. "James, what in God's name is happening? The ground is shaking." I turned, my eyes wide, my mouth dry. I think I made it angry. He stared at me, his gaze a mixture of fear and accusation. "Angry? What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, the thrumming intensified. The walls of the control room seemed to breathe, to bulge outwards. The air crackled with an unseen energy. A section of the ceiling directly above my colleague tore open, not with a crash of debris, but with a sickening, silent rip. From the rent, something descended. It wasn't a thing, not in any way I could comprehend. It was. Hungry, my colleague screamed, a choked, ragged sound. He stumbled back, his eyes fixed on the impossible shape that now filled the space where the ceiling had been. I watched, frozen, as the distortion reached for him. It didn't touch him, it simply unmade him. One moment he was there, a solid, terrified human being. The next he was gone, not a trace, no sound, no residue, just absence. The tearing sound stopped. The thrumming subsided, replaced by an even more terrifying stillness. The impossible shape retreated, dissolving back into the air, leaving behind only a faint, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. My breath hitched. I looked at the blank monitors, the silent equipment, the empty space where my colleague had stood. Instead, I had drawn its attention, and it had responded. What had I unleashed? The silent rip above my colleague widened. It wasn't a tear in metal or plaster. It was a tear in everything. Light bled through not the familiar spectrum of our sun, but a viscous, shifting aurora of colors I'd never seen, never conceived of. They pulsed not with light, but with sound, a deep, resonating hum that vibrated in my bones, a discordant choir that clawed at the edges of my sanity. My colleague, their face a mask of frozen horror, simply dissolved. Not in a mess of gore, but in a gentle unfurling. Like a banner caught in a phantom wind, their form unraveling into the impossible hues. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I scrambled back, my chair scraping against the scarred concrete floor of the control room. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something acrid and ancient, like dust disturbed after millennia. The consoles flickered, their screens displaying static that writhed with the same alien light. The hum intensified, a physical pressure against my eardrums. It was the sound of the universe weeping, or perhaps of it being unmade. I had to get out. I had to warn them. But the door, a thick blast-proof slab, was sealed shut. The emergency overrides were dead, the lights on the panel dark and unresponsive. The very walls of the control room seemed to ripple, the concrete softening, flowing like thick tar. The thrumming was inside me now, a parasitic resonance that threatened to split me open from the inside. My gaze was drawn back to the rent in the ceiling. The aurora of impossible colors pulsed faster. It was an absence, a hole punched through existence. Not eyes, not any sensory organ I understood, but a profound, ancient awareness. It was the entity, the one I'd glimpsed in the data, the whisper in the static. It was here, my mind reeled. This wasn't just a signal, this was an invasion, an unraveling. My past failure, the theoretical miscalculation that had cost lives, felt like a child's scraped knee compared to this. This was the end of everything. Then a memory, sharp and clear, surfaced from the chaos, the archaeological dig. The layers of civilization, each built atop the ruins of the last, leading down to something primordial, something that defied explanation. The patterns etched into the deepest temple walls, the ones that mirrored the anomalous signal. They weren't a language. They were a key, a blueprint, a way to interact. The entity's presence grew stronger, the pressure in the room becoming unbearable. I could feel my own atoms beginning to fray, the familiar solidity of my body starting to waver. This was it, oblivion. But if I understood the patterns, if I could replicate them. My hands, trembling violently, found the damaged console. The touch screen was still faintly illuminated, displaying corrupted code. I ignored the gibberish. I focused on the raw data streams, the spectral analysis of the signal. The entity's manifestation was accelerating, its influence bleeding into our reality. The hum was now a deafening roar. The walls were no longer just rippling, they were beginning to fold inward, the very geometry of the room distorting. I had to act. I had to try. I began to tap, not at the controls, but at the very air, my fingers tracing the ancient patterns I'd seen. I was not fighting it. I was responding to it. I was attempting to speak its language, to find a resonance that wouldn't shatter me, but might, just might, offer a different path. The spectral lines on the dying screen flickered, attempting to sync with my movements. Was it working, or was this just my mind grasping at straws in the face of annihilation? It felt like a question, a profound, terrifying query posed to the entirety of existence. And I, James, a disgraced scientist, was the only one left to answer. The air around me began to shimmer, not with the alien light, but with the distortion of my own collapsing reality. The entity was no longer just above me. It was within me. What would happen if I failed to find the right pattern? The air in the underground bunker was thick, stagnant, tasting of dust and something metallic like old blood. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the oppressive quiet. The corrupted code on the console flickered, a dying ember. The spectral analysis, however, held. It was a tapestry of impossibilities, a symphony of frequencies that should not exist, woven by something that should not be. The entity's manifestation, I understood now, wasn't a physical arrival, but a bleed, a tearing of the veil. I remember a sound then, not through my ears, but directly into the marrow of my bones. A low thrumming, like the universe itself groaning under an unbearable weight. It vibrated through the concrete floor, up my legs into my teeth. My vision swam. The familiar gray walls of the bunker seemed to warp, to ripple like heat haze. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them, trying to force the world back into its proper shape. When I opened them, the distortions were gone, but a faint, iridescent shimmer clung to the edges of my vision. The signal, it was fading. The impossible frequencies were attenuating, the cacophony resolving back into the static hum of the planet. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, so profound it felt like my very soul was draining away. I slumped against the console, my body a dead weight. I had survived. The immediate pressure, the suffocating presence that had filled the bunker was receding, but it hadn't vanished. It had merely withdrawn, like a tide pulling back, only to reveal a seabed littered with horrors. My gaze fell upon a small, tarnished silver locket lying near the edge of the console. I didn't remember seeing it before. It was intricately carved, depicting symbols I vaguely recognized from ancient astronomical charts, but twisted, alien. Hesitantly, I reached for it. The metal was cool to the touch, unnaturally so. As my fingers brushed its surface, a faint warmth bloomed within me, a brief, startling echo of the entity's presence. A whisper of understanding, too vast to grasp, too alien to articulate, brushed against my consciousness. It spoke of cycles, of immense durations, of realities folding in upon themselves. I snatched my hand away, the locket clattering back onto the console. The data streams on the screen were normalizing, the spectral anomalies smoothing out into mundane readings. The entity was gone, or at least its immediate influence was. But the knowledge it had imprinted upon me, that was indelible. I had glimpsed something that defied every law I'd ever studied, something that existed outside the framework of our understanding. I pushed myself away from the console, my limbs stiff and uncooperative. It was pregnant with the memory of that sound, that pressure. I felt a profound loneliness, a chasm opening between me and the rest of humanity. How could I ever explain what I had experienced? How could I articulate the sheer, terrifying scope of what lay beyond our fragile perception? My thoughts drifted to the surface, to the archaeological dig revealing temple beneath temple. The strange glyphs on the unearthed stones, the unsettling geometry of the lower chambers. I had dismissed them as primitive curiosities, as the ramblings of minds too simple to grasp true cosmology. Now I understood. They were echoes, warnings, attempts by those who had glimpsed the fringes of the entity's existence, millennia ago, to record its passage, to chart its influence. They had seen it, and they had left their testament buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for a time when the veil would thin again. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the grime of the bunker, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible luminescence, like phosphorescence on a deep-sea creature. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, mirroring the dying thrum I had felt in my bones. It was a physical manifestation of the entity's touch, a brand seared into my very being. I was no longer just James, the disgraced astrophysicist. I was something else now, a vessel, perhaps. Only the faint, eerie glow from my own hands provided any illumination. I stood there, breathing in the stale air, the metallic tang sharper now, almost coppery. The entity had retreated, but the world, the reality I had known, felt irrevocably altered. The vast, indifferent emptiness of space no longer seemed empty. It teemed with unseen horrors, with intelligences that dwarfed our own into insignificance. And I, James, carried a fragment of that terrifying immensity within me. Had I truly escaped, or had I merely become a conduit for its eventual return? It was a tapestry of impossibilities, a language woven from the very fabric of existence, not spoken, but felt. It pulsed with a rhythm that predated stars, a slow, agonizing beat that resonated deep within my bones. I was still in the bunker, the chill seeping through my worn clothes when the tremors began. Not the violent shaking of an earthquake, but a deep, guttural thrumming that seemed to originate from the planet's core. The lights on the consoles stuttered, then died, plunging me into a Stygian blackness broken only by the faint, phosphorescent glow of the corrupted data. The metallic tang in the air intensified, now laced with a faint, acrid scent like ozone and decay. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the controls. I had to get out. I had to see. The ascent felt interminable, each step a struggle against an unseen force. The bunker's metal door, usually groaning in protest, slid open with a sickening, silent hiss. I emerged into a world that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. The sky, usually a comforting expanse of blue, was a bruised, swirling canvas of sickly greens and purples. I was at the edge of the archaeological dig, revealing temple beneath temple. Structures that defied geometry, angles that twisted and folded in on themselves, carved from a stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The tremors were stronger here, resonating from the depths, from the very heart of the newly revealed ruins, cloaked and hunched, stood near the edge of the excavation, their silhouette stark against the churning sky. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, stared past me, at something I couldn't yet perceive. "It's waking," they breathed, their voice barely audible above the rising hum of the planet. The signal. It wasn't a message, it was a key, and we turned it. My gaze followed their vacant stare. The air above the deepest excavation shimmered, distorting the bizarre structures below. A vortex of Inkai blackness began to form, not like a storm, but like a wound in reality. It was empty, yet it felt impossibly full. The spectral analysis from the bunker flashed in my mind, the impossible frequencies. It wasn't just data, it was a presence, and it was here. A profound, soul-shattering understanding washed over me. My past failure, my disgrace, it was all a prelude, a cosmic joke. Humanity, with all its striving and its science, was merely a fleeting spark, an insignificant ripple in an ocean of unfathomable age and indifferent power. The entity, whatever it was, didn't care about our equations or our ambitions. It simply was. And now it was stretching. The ground beneath my feet lurched. A low, guttural groan, not of earth, but of something vast and ancient stirring, emanated from the vortex. The cloaked archaeologists stumbled back, their hands flying to their ears as if to block out a sound that could only be heard by the soul. There was no resolution to this, no fighting back, only witnessing. The stars, the nebulae, the very laws of physics that had consumed my life, they were all just the fragile shell of a reality that was about to be peeled back. The vortex expanded. The colors in the sky bled into one another, forming patterns that made my mind recoil. I could feel my own consciousness fraying, struggling to contain the sheer, unadulterated wrongness of it all. I understood then. The signal wasn't a call to arms. It was a lament. A warning from a consciousness so ancient, so vast, that its very awakening was the end of everything we knew. As the blackness began to consume the bruised sky, I closed my eyes. Not in surrender, but in a desperate attempt to hold onto something, anything, that was still mine. But even my thoughts felt borrowed, a fleeting echo in a universe that was now reclaiming itself. The last thing I registered was the scent. Not metallic, not ozone, but something akin to petrichor after an eternal rain, mixed with the dust of dead suns. Did the universe simply cease to be, or did it simply change? And if it changed, what horrors now resided in the spaces between what used to be?